Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining today's panel where we're going to be unpacking some of the opportunities, some of the challenges, and things people are working on today at the intersection of real-world data and prospective clinical trials. You know, for several years, I would hear this question asked over and over again in different conferences and various settings, this question of which will rule out in the future and will real-world data replace randomized clinical trials? I think the reality is we're finding more and more that there's an important space for each, and perhaps even most interesting for this conversation today, an important intersection between the two. My name is Craig Lipset. I'll be your host today. I'm an independent advisor working with organizations on innovative approaches in clinical trials. And I'd like to first thank our hosts for bringing us together, the folks from Datavant who have kindly brought this forum together. And with that, I think we're good to move forward. Well, I'd like to begin our panel by letting our hosts our guests introduce themselves. And in doing so, I'm going to ask them to share a little bit of perspective for you on where they sit with regards to real world data so that everyone in the audience can have an understanding of the perspectives each of our panelists will bring. Michelle, would you like to kick us off?
I'd be pleased to, Craig. Good to be with everybody today. Thank you so much for spending the time together to explore this really pivotal topic for us. I am Michelle Hoyseth. I am the Chief Data Officer at Parexel. As part of that role, I am responsible for our real-world data solutions in the application of real-world data at the various points in which we believe it can have an impact across the clinical development spectrum. So from feasibility, study optimization, and design to how we should be thinking about it in life cycle management and new ways to execute safety surveillance and pharmacovigilance. With respect to real world data, my passion is really rooted in my background as a clinical researcher. I spent the bulk of my life in, the randomized clinical trial side of development. And, what I see is the potential for us to really unlock our understanding of the impact of therapies across a broader array of parameters, meaningful parameters. Yes, beyond safety and efficacy, yes, about, outcomes, but yes, including the way we view safety and efficacy. And so I'm really stand for, us looking at clinical development and its processes in the way we move through that differently and leveraging the data to do it better.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome. I'd like to next introduce our second panelist, Sharon Terry. Sharon, would you like to introduce yourself for the audience?
Yes, thanks very much, Craig. I'm Sharon Terry. I'm the president and CEO of Genetic Alliance. Genetic Alliance is an alliance, a coalition of patient advocacy groups and other communities and health organizations. We come together to work together around how to accelerate research for all diseases. And my interest in real-world evidence and real-world data comes from the real-world side. I am a former college chaplain. My two kids were diagnosed in 1994 with a genetic condition, and I founded the first patient registry founded by patients. I've been very interested in, and well before it was called real world anything, in how these data could be incorporated into the various research enterprises as well as all the way to the ends of interventional development, and have now worked to put together a pretty large platform whereby patient advocacy groups and communities, Black Lives Matters, for example, Pennsylvania Fracking Coalition, as well as lots and lots of disease groups, can bring these data in a place where they're structured, where they're able to be accessed for clinical studies, clinical trials, along with EHRs from 700,000 portals in the US, as well as genomic information. I have a robust data partner now, Luna DNA, which is a company working on this, and really interested in how do we transform the clinical trial space especially in the age of pandemics when we can't do trials the way we used to and feel like we're really coming into our own now after many, many years of trying to say that these data are critical for the endeavors that we're undertaking.
Thank you, Sharon. Fabulous to have you here. Our next panelist, Sean Cozen, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Craig. It's great to be part of this session and important discussion. I'm Sean Cozen, Global Head of Data Science Innovation at Johnson & Johnson, Janssen R&D. I joined the company back in December of 2019 from the FDA, where I ran data science and health information technology for the agency, and also the Oncology Center of Excellence, being an oncologist by training. So I think real-world evidence plays a critical role in therapeutic development, and also by extension in how we can optimize care delivery and care quality at the point of routine care. And as we all know, the gap between therapeutic development, and that is something that has been a major motif in discussions that have focused traditionally around the idea of a learning health system. So overall, I think we're moving in the right direction. And just to summarize why real-world evidence is important from a therapeutic development perspective, there are two ways of looking at it. One is that traditional clinical trials tend to be rather reductionist in terms of the population of patients that can be incorporated into these studies. For example, we all know that eligibility criteria are somewhat narrow in traditional clinical trials. And in cases, for example, in the adult oncology setting, we also know that only 3% of patients, adult oncology patients in the United States, have access to clinical trials. And there are a number of barriers to clinical trial participation. So the evidence that is generated using traditional clinical trials may not always extrapolate to the needs of patients at the point of routine care. So, and there's a mathematical way and a mathematical reason for thinking about real-world evidence in the context of therapeutic development. So if extrapolation of evidence emerging from clinical trials is not always easy to extrapolate at the point of routine care, that means that the results of some traditional clinical trials lack external validity. They're internally valid, but they lack external validity. And in fact, external validity is what the clinician needs to personalize treatment decision at the point of routine care. So real-world evidence can accommodate the type of studies that address that external validity deficit in traditional clinical trials, where we can have additional means of providing evidence to folks at the point of routine care to tailor treatments to the needs of individual patients. And that is really the promise of precision medicine and personalized medicine. And really, without real-world evidence, given that there are many barriers to participating in clinical trials, without real-world evidence, we will always have a challenge in personalizing treatments at the point of care, which is where the majority of the population is under active monitoring and treatment.
Thank you, Sean. Hopefully our audience can see we have three panelists representing three very complementary perspectives, and we are looking forward to covering a nice range of use cases together. I do want to acknowledge we're missing a panelist here. You may have noticed Chris Boone from AbbVie was expected to be with us today. Unfortunately, this is the year of unpredictable COVID-19, and we'll wish Chris well. However, that fourth chair is not going to be empty. That's going to be your chair in the audience. You have a Q&A tab. I'm hoping that you're all actively opening that tab and getting ready to populate your questions, participate in this conversation with us. Counting on you for that. So Let's jump in. For this conversation, I'm looking forward to us covering a few key themes around our ability to link and bring real-world data into our prospective clinical trials. And hopefully together by the end of our time, you'll have a good sense of the why as we begin by talking about use cases, as well as the how as we start to share more on execution and some strategies for successfully executing in this new world. But let's begin on this theme of use cases. And Michelle, you kicked us off really well by opening with a few different use cases that seem to be front of mind for you. As you're thinking about this ability to link and bring real-world data into prospective trials, what are some of the use cases that are front of mind to you that you're prioritizing in your role and with the clients that you're interacting with?
Right. So if our shared aim as an industry, right, if we do our jobs well as an industry, we will shorten the time it takes to get safe, effective therapies in the hands of patients, and we will reduce the price to develop them, right, and make them more accessible on that front. In order to do so, I think we'd all agree we need to understand patient populations better. Coming into study design, we need to have a seamlessness between what we understand of patients in the healthcare setting, with our view of them in clinical trials and all the controls that we put into protocol designs that, as Sean put it so elegantly, naturally and necessarily to an extent, limit the population, right? Expose the variable of treatment as the only variable. But, and then on the backside, create similar seamlessness as those patients come out of the clinical research or randomized clinical trial setting and into that post-market authorization phase, and we begin to understand the true impact of therapies on the broader, messier, real-world patient population. So if we can understand who Craig is before the study, who Craig is in the study, who Craig is after the study, and create that longitudinality, absolutely, and without question, we will reduce fragmentation in our planning and our approach. We'll pick better endpoints. We'll pick not only the gold standards of randomized clinical trials for safety and efficacy, but endpoints that matter to patients, and really reflect the true value of a treatment. And it will also allow us to better look at the treatment, the therapy in isolation, but also as part of a total care cohort, as integrated or more complete care, particularly in multi-system disease like diabetes and cardiovascular disease, right? In a way that we can't. And last but not least, pharmaceuticals are 10 or 15% of the total cost of healthcare, and yes, they get the headline right now in terms of cost, but if we're going to do right by society and really try to do something meaningful to reduce the cost of healthcare, we really have to participate as a life science industry in the shift from volume-based care systems to value, right? To really understanding the true impact of our therapies on the total well-being on the population. So for me, that seamlessness becomes everything. Never mind the things that you and I have talked about 100 times, like patient perspective and how sad they are, to leave their trial and go back, kind of get dumped back into the healthcare setting, right? We can do a lot better.
Michelle, do you see some of the potential new study designs, whether pragmatic trials or decentralized trials or creation of synthetic control arms? Are these still science fiction, or are you seeing applications and use cases coming to life today?
No, we really are. Depending on sort of what's weighting my thinking when I answer that question, the thing I'm most passionate about in terms of changing the way we work is synthetic control arms, particularly for rare disease or patients whose condition is, either permanently disabling or perhaps terminal, right? Our initial experience with synthetic control arms reduced enrollment by over a year, so reduced the cost to do the study by probably 30%. It allowed patients to, it leveraged, single line data, so patients weren't randomized to placebo, the patients who have a terminal diagnosis in this instance. And the most interesting thing was that the synthetic control arm cohort was actually better matched to the investigational arm cohort by virtue of the process. That was very unexpected, that value. Now, to our other point, we have to make sure we understand when we take away all those controls, what else happens, in the patient population. But I think, moving to synthetic control arms could be one of the most impactful things we could do to the time and cost of clinical trials. From another perspective, when I think about, what we do post-market authorization, one of the things I find most maddening right now is that we still rely on a voluntary reporting system for patient safety, MedWatch and Shams reports. Can we not do better than that for our people today? Can we not be leveraging healthcare in looking better for safety signals and really understand? Those are the things that are available to us today that weren't even, 3 years ago, never mind 5 years ago, right?
Interesting, right? And so in the context of that prospective trial, being able to link in real world data to support better safety surveillance by connecting right into its source. That's fabulous. Thank you, Michelle. Sharon, I'd like to turn over to you. I'm curious, as you're thinking about real world data coming into prospective trials, what are some of the use cases that are front and center in your mind?
So I think I usually come to this from the perspective of the people and the inconvenience of many trials for individuals as they start to enroll in prospective clinical trials, and the fact that many times the endpoints aren't ones that they're at least understanding and maybe even not interested in, and that we need to begin to be able to combine some of those. And so a few of the use cases that come to me are a group that I'm working with right now, for example, in epilepsy, where the parents are not interested in an endpoint being the number of seizures per day, but instead things like eye contact, ability to reach and grab or grasp, and even things like being able to sit the child up because they drool all the time, and whether or not the trial is going to address those sorts of things. Other ones for me are in especially some of the neuromotor diseases, the choice of individuals to retain certain function, like perhaps typing versus walking. Those sorts of things start to matter a lot to the individuals themselves. And that as I work toward getting real world evidence, real world data integrated better, my interest is in finding out how we can go to where people live, eat, work, pray, play, whatever we want to say, and integrate this better into their lives such that they are not in a situation whereby they in fact have increased some of their symptoms or some of the even physiological difficulties by virtue of moving to a place where they're challenged, where their environment's not the same for them as it would be at home, et cetera. And then I very much share Michelle's concern too, that many people feel very cared for, the very few percent of Americans who do participate in clinical trials, and that they don't experience that in the usual healthcare system. So I'm wondering, how do we continue that kind of care such that they feel that their effort was worth it and that they get the attention they got during the trial?
Thanks, Sharon. And, one of those use cases you called out sounds like it picks up on that theme of 2020 of decentralizing our trials, of shifting location. And so it does sound interesting as we think about still needing diversity of data from our research participants. How can we capture more data from real world data sources, electronic health records or otherwise, so that we're not making compromises, right? We're able to still collect the data that we need to answer research questions. Is that the sense that you're getting as well?
Yes, very much so. And it's interesting in our dialogue with biopharmaceutical companies that there seems to be some reticence around how much can the trial take place in the person's home or community, questions around privacy, for example, and whether certain kinds of monitoring should or shouldn't be allowed. And what we hear from the patients often is just please learn what it is for me to live with this condition. And I know you need to quantify that. So let's figure out together what methods, what devices, what interventions, even in the home, could be quantifiable, could be reportable through various either telemedicine or direct contact between devices and servers, et cetera. So I am experiencing a great deal of interest. There's also a reimagination, I think, in the part of a lot of patients around, well, we couldn't get to that trial. It's not going to happen now. And when the trialists begin to talk about, well, we're bringing it to your home, there's suddenly a real easing and a greater interest. And I think we're going to see a lot more retention as well.
Thank you, Sharon. Sean, I want to hear from you what use cases are most urgent or front of mind. But before you do that, one question from our audience is, can you help with just a simple definition of real world data and how we're using it? So I thought, Sean, perhaps you can start with that. How do you define real world data for your work?
Well, I try to be as consistent as possible with the definition that essentially the FDA has codified, which is real world data is data generated outside of traditional clinical trials. And traditional is in fact highlighted in that definition because clinical trials and real world evidence are not mutually exclusive. And that's a nuanced topic that we can perhaps address during the discussion. So data outside of traditional clinical trials includes data from electronic health records, data from claims, data from biosensors and wearables, data from registries, anything that is outside of what we traditionally think a prospective clinical trial is. So that's the definition that I use, which is essentially the definition that the FDA has codified.
Thank you, Sean. And now back to the original question for you. What use cases are you seeing as perhaps most impactful for your medicine development organization who are running those prospective clinical trials? Where might they be able to bring real world data into those trials in ways that can be a step change in medicine development?
Well, addressing the needs of populations of patients that may not be adequately represented in the clinical trial. So as we know, we touched on that earlier, that some clinical trials, because of necessity, you need to optimize internal validity, especially in early phase studies when even the dose may not be fully optimized. So you need a controlled environment, and having a narrow eligibility criteria is reasonable and rational. However, just out of habit, a lot of organizations kind of continue that through late phase development, and you may argue that's not necessary. So there are population of patients that are never investigated in clinical trials, and there are population of patients that don't have access to clinical trials. These are minorities, older population of patients that just for a variety of different reasons, inadequate access to healthcare resources, socioeconomic barriers, don't have access to clinical trials. So generating evidence on those individuals and those patients is critical, because once a product is on the market, it's available for the most part to a large segment of society, and clinicians and sponsors of drugs and biologics do want to provide and have adequate evidence to tailor treatments to those individual needs. So generating evidence and showing the value of therapies in populations of patients that have been inadequately represented in the investigation supporting the approval of the product. Secondly, I think this is also important to highlight. It's to have a better idea of the longitudinal experience of patients. Clinical trials are a snapshot. You know, they have time zero when the patient is enrolled, and there's study stopping criteria that are very concretely established. Well, patients go through their experience before and after a clinical trial. So to be able to capture that longitudinal experience is of critical importance, especially as we think about new ways of demonstrating the value of therapies in the real world.
That's a great way to consider this intersection, right? We've got this depth of data that we're able to generate within a prospective clinical trial through our case report forms and other interventions and procedures, but that breadth that you're envisioning to really complement the trial data with that bigger longitudinal story. Michelle, there are quite a few questions that have come in on this topic of synthetic controls. And so I would like to come back to this. I'll start with if you have a simple definition of a synthetic control, but then also just start to share a little bit on what might be data sources that we need to generate these types of synthetic controls. Michelle?
Yeah, I've been watching the Q&A too. So basically, I think, like many things related to RWD in our industry right now, the nomenclature can be pretty messy and not used very consistently. And so I think the two most common terms I'm hearing used right now are both synthetic control arms, but also external control arms. There's a little penchant for external control arms as a phrase. But in either case, we're really looking at a data set around a patient cohort that is derived by a means other than direct observation of the patient in the randomized clinical trial and a capture of that data and put into the EDC system. So we could use registry data, we could use EMR data, we could use wearable data, to Sean's point about the definition of RWD. But really what we're trying to do is develop a data set and a means other than randomization to a treatment arm and prospective participation in a study, and use that data set to compare it to the investigational arm in the protocol. So, at its highest level. Now, which data set you use depends on your protocol objective, right? And so there are certainly instances where we might be able to leverage placebo data from past randomized clinical trials in that therapy area, and that's the best data set to prove out the point. There's certainly instances where it's not, where we really do need more natural history type sources, existing standard of care sources. So it's very protocol design dependent. And on the point of protocol design, I think one of the other learnings that's really coming to the fore is that if we really do want to leverage these sources of data to their greatest effect in the development of therapies, we do have to think about our protocol designs differently. This is not best done if we design the protocol the way we always did and we jam the non-randomized clinical trial data into it. It's best done if we contemplate the sources of those data and let them inform some of the design, and even be courageous enough to let it inform some of our EDC design elements, right? The data play together. They don't play separately.
Are there some therapeutic areas that lend themselves better than others, or does it really vary by the questions in the protocol?
I think it does vary by the questions, and it also varies by our regulatory bodies, right? What are the endpoints that are going to be accepted? If we're looking for newer endpoints, are they sufficiently, trusted, validated, et cetera? And our ability to surface other insights on the impact of therapy. One of the examples that Sharon shared was, whether a patient could type as opposed to walk. Well, in structured data in EMR, we see the result of the 6-minute walk test. When that poor criticized test as it is today, but good example. But when that blunt instrument isn't sensitive enough to really detect treatment impact, you know, there is no structured field for typing. It's hiding somewhere in the narrative of the EMR, right? And so, you know, how we look at the data and how we let more sensitive measures present themselves to us and how we let that inform the protocol design and what we ask differently of the in-clinic procedures. I mean, that it opens up a whole new, perhaps in, you know, hopefully better way.
Interesting. And I would imagine in some of the questions are even raising if there are algorithmic approaches then to have patients bring more of their longitudinal data into the trial and perhaps create digital twins for the patients in that same trial to serve as their own controls. But all of that's probably only realistic if we are able to get this diverse longitudinal data around those who are in our trial. Sharon, there's a question from the audience that I think links a little bit to some of the attributes you were talking about earlier. When we're able to bring in this diversity of data, how might we start to leverage more social determinants of health and use the diverse data that we're able to now bring in from the real world to better understand what's happening with the lives of our patients?
Yeah, so this is a very important issue for me because I think we have, and we know this, tried the one-size-fits-all paradigm in the past, and it's certainly a failed model now. And that as we start to look at the diversity of people, the stratification of medicines and populations, real-world evidence, real-world data around their socioeconomic status, around the demographics they bring to the table are important. While trials are severely under-enrolled, it doesn't work really because there's so much noise in such a small population as are usually enrolled. And I think what we need to see are more ways to gather that information, certainly using wearables, for example, PRO that are easily accessed. And then the data that we do collect day to day, and we have now robust amounts and lots is known about us in a variety of ways, could be applied to health in ways, and I know certainly DataVant and others are doing that make a difference around how we then structure the trial. And I'll kind of pile on a bit with what Michelle said at the end of her answer, in that if we bring that kind of data plus people's preferences and start to do prioritization of what even individuals and communities might feel around conditions and what should be endpoints for real results, for alleviating suffering, for real treatment, then I think the compilation of what we have in the past used in terms of the clinical data, as well as the patient-reported outcomes and the real-world evidence of day-to-day living will make an enormous difference. I also noticed a question about, and so what about the people we're leaving behind in the electronic deserts, essentially? And I have enormous concern for that, and that's where I'm real interested too in the data that is being collected on all of us in various ways that are more passive. And while I don't want to see that done without our permission, so to speak, I want to see that used for good purposes, and that all of us intersect in some ways with systems that do capture data, even if we don't have the means yet ourselves to have the electronic devices that the more affluent individuals do. And so I'm hoping, for example, in very basic things like in the new administration, will we go back to wiring the entire nation with broadband? We kind of left that off for the last 4 or 5 years, and I think getting back to that very basic thing would make a huge difference for the work that we're all trying to do here.
Sharon, I think your answer also sets us up to start to think about what types of infrastructure do we need to successfully execute in this environment, whether we're thinking about diversity of data sources or otherwise. And Sean, this was a topic that you had shared with me a framework for me to think about with regards to successfully executing when we're thinking about bringing real world data into our trials. There were 3 elements you had mentioned: our organizational capability, our technical, and the regulatory. Can you elaborate more on that framework and what you meant by those 3 elements?
Sure. Organizationally, I think that's probably one of the most important components of fully leveraging the opportunities that exist in accessing external data assets and real world data. And in a way that also speaks to, I believe, what Michelle was referring to in terms of creating opportunities where we can look at a protocol that we're designing with an eye towards the opportunities that exist in collecting real world data. So there has to be, in order for R&D organizations to accommodate that, they have to have the appropriate organizational construct that starts to ask different questions during the design of studies very early in development, and thinking about opportunities that exist in incorporating real-world evidence, whether in the post-market setting or during development in terms of creating external controls very early in development. So that takes a lot of organizational structure to accommodate that, because currently that's not really part of how many R&D organizations are currently supporting their workflows and advancing the programs. But obviously, having the appropriate technical infrastructure to analyze and ensure data quality is important. But we don't have to overemphasize the technical piece, because there are a lot of great solutions out there, and that's something that in a way has been commoditized. And then the regulatory piece is also important, because in cases where one would like to, for example, support a labeling change, having input from the regulators early on during development is critical. And this is something that has to be baked into the development program, rather than inserted too late into the program, where one would have to rush engaging with regulatory bodies. And those discussions can be quite complex. However, if it's done, if there's an organizational substrate that can accommodate incorporation of real-world evidence at an early stage, then naturally and organically that becomes part of the engagement with regulatory bodies to ensure appropriate and organized advancement of the development program and the use of real-world evidence in the appropriate settings.
Sean, you've interacted with many different research sponsors through the years in your prior roles. You're immersive with one now. Do organizations need a top-down mandate in order to drive adoption at scale of these new approaches? Are study teams friendly to these new approaches, or do they need some cover and support from their leadership?
I think support and sponsorship is critical. However, progress really occurs where the rubber meets the road. So enabling folks on the ground to start to incorporate these new themes into their workflows is critical. And that requires bespoke solutions. Every R&D organization is different, every therapeutic area is different. And within each therapeutic area, generally speaking, in any R&D organization, there are different ways of looking at advancing programs. So it has to be the appropriate balance, appropriate sponsorship and top-down leadership, combined with the ability to really empower folks on the ground who are actively engaged in writing protocols, thinking about the evidence package that's needed early in development, and giving them the tools and the knowledge systems that they need to appropriately incorporate real-world evidence into their workflows and development programs.
Greg, do you mind if I build on
Sean.
that quickly? Because
I was heading right over to you, Michelle. Absolutely.
That is such an important point. You know, that's such a great question. So I would tell you, we see it happen both ways, right? We have large pharma companies that create formal incentives to adopt digital innovation in the protocols, right? And it does help teams feel brave in, doing the protocol differently. But where it still comes apart is it's the same old conventional protocol design with a digital solution overlay. And that's missing the whole opportunity to do it differently, to develop the therapy better. And so I feel like underneath this, there's this slightly more complex issue, which is, bridging skills and knowledge so that the people who have always written the breast cancer protocols are thinking differently about the access to data and tools and can let it influence the design decisions. On the flip side, we know, companies that have commitments to digital innovation at the C-suite level. And in those instances, when they don't flow down, I will tell you, when it gets down to the study team level and they're having to take risk on with doing it a new way, it's a very hard decision to make, and you will pretty rapidly see the innovations start to get walked backwards. So there needs to be, we need better connectivity between, strategic intent and operational delivery.
And so, Michelle, from an operational delivery perspective, what have you needed to put in place inside of Parexel in order to deliver in this category?
Yeah, I mean, gosh knows it's a work in progress, right? But it's been everything from thinking about data scientist as an experience base versus a role, and where does data science need to sit in the business, to procedural development, to trying to catalyze the discussion around, the spirit of GCP and things like traceability matrices and lineage, and how does that work with these new data types? I mean, if you don't address effectively the requirements to, meet the standards of safety and efficacy, and you can't translate how that will operate in new data sources, you won't be able to step forward. And then, you do run into skills gaps and roles there too, right?
No doubt, in terms of workforce readiness to meet the demand that the research community is creating here. Sharon, you work with a lot of different organizations around these types of topics. I'm sure you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. What have people done that have made things work well in terms of bringing the right capacity to execute? Or, are there any horror stories you want to share and protect with an anonymity the names of the innocent?
I think probably one of the things I could comment on is a clinical study that I'm involved in right now for the disease my kids have, pseudoxanthoma elasticum. And with the advent of the pandemic, trying to shift to a clinical trial done remotely from the point of view of the researchers and investigators, and at home from the point of view of the patients. And I think the horror story part of it is very much like Michelle said, the senior leaders are ready for innovation. They're looking at novel ways to do this. And when it gets to the people on the ground and even the CRO, they're finding, and to the IRB at the institution where this is being conducted, there's a lot of concern that things should not change, and essentially that we should try to just force this new situation into the old box. And the horror story of it, I think, is we're going to miss a lot of important data. We're also going to make this more complicated by far than it needs to be. In fact, there's parts of it that could be much more simple. One of the innovations that we're taking on is we're going to run a parallel study at my foundation, my tiny foundation, PXE International's expense, and show that, in fact, this could be done far more innovatively, and it will allow the investigators at the end of the day to compare the data using our Luna DNA platform, this integration of various data types, and in people's homes and then look and see, was there something to be gained by doing this in a more novel way than they currently are looking. I'm also seeing some horror stories about trying to put some observations into, for example, a Zoom medium like this. And the kind of things that some investigators think patients will be comfortable with are pretty interesting. In the case of PXE, you have to look at groin skin, for example. I don't think that's a good thing to be examining with Zoom. I think there could be other ways to do it with FaceTime and things like that. So I think we're in this kind of maybe a late childhood, early adolescence of some of this real world data that make it hard for the traditionalists to understand what's happening. I'm real happy for those innovative C-suite fellows and gals, but I think I think the workforce has not been educated well yet.
Things are still viewed as risk for them, right? Or demands on them without having the needed support around them to be able to execute. Sean, there are some questions that have come in. You'd mentioned earlier that some of the technology needs that your organization may have are available. They can almost be off the shelf, but some people are wondering about data sources. And how do you choose the right data sources for different use cases and challenges? And in particular, an adjacent question, is there such a thing as regulatory grade real world data?
Sure, that's a great question. So it's a nuanced one. So starting with how to decide on data sources. Well, obviously it's driven by the specific use cases. However, thinking about the quality of the data early on is a critical part of determining the appropriate data assets and data sources. As we all know, real world data could be quite messy, and in order to accommodate advancing therapeutic programs across the regulatory threshold, data quality becomes of critical importance. And that speaks to the second part of the question, what is regulatory grade data? Well, there is no formal definition for that, and it's a good concept to think about, because even though it's in the eye of the beholder in some ways, it drives us to think hardly about and focus on data quality. We can flip to ask the same question: what is regulatory grade data in the context of traditional clinical trials? How do we ensure data integrity? What are the mechanisms we use? What gives us and the regulators comfort that not the evidence, not the results of the study, but the data itself is valid and of high quality? Well, there are procedures in place that support that. Clinical site inspections is procedural. There are no there's no technical magic. There are no mathematical or statistical maneuvers that one can do to ensure data integrity. It's procedural, and in traditional clinical trials, site inspections and a number of protocol deviations, and then one makes an intuitive and judgment on data quality and data integrity. So the more we think about data quality and data integrity and data regulatory grade data in the context of having putting into place the procedures that can give confidence. It's about building confidence in the integrity of data and the ability to do source document verification. All the stuff that we do in traditional clinical trials speak to what comprises regulatory grade data, because really there's no definition, and not just for real world data, but even for traditional clinical trials.
Michelle, do you have perspectives on this topic? And if you're consuming different streams of real world data from different sources, how do you manage that within your organization? One question even asking about, do you have to scrub for duplicates with multiple data sources to answer a particular question?
Yeah, that is deduping data from multiple sources just came up in COVID-19 vaccine surveillance this morning. How are we going to dedupe the data sets, right? Which is maybe a nice setting, you know, a nice example of the challenge, right? Because we've got patients, COVID patients who have opted into registries all over the place. We have state level registries. We have decentralized clinical trial platforms that are capturing history of disease. And now we have randomized clinical trials with vaccines, and we need to follow these patients, you know, under EUA and accelerated pathway approvals. There's lots of post-marketing commitments, right, in PV that we've got to do. Not to shamelessly plug for our sponsor, but actually I would say that our first go-to to try to dedupe data sets is to see if we can tokenize them and do the token matching and reduce the duplicates. It's the best way. And our ability to do so really depends on the data sets we're looking at, and also depends on the geography, you know, whether we can pursue that means or not. The other thing that maybe doesn't get enough airtime is access to context around the way that data were generated, the data set that you're looking at, how it was generated. If you can't get well into the standard of care, and you can't understand, you know, you can't validate some patterns you're seeing in the data with some of the clinical decision making, et cetera, you really are flying blind if you need to use the data for a very, you know, a purpose that sort of needs to meet a high threshold of rigor and completeness in the data, and understanding that the data set that you've acquired from outside your study, or, you know, one to the next, are, you know, appropriately generalizable for the purpose of the clinical question you're answering, and comparable to the data set that you intend to either merge it with or compare it with. So that right off the bat shortlists your data sets, right? If you can't get in there and figure that out, and you're using, you know, Sean, I loved your answer on regulatory grade versus research grade data, right? But if you can't get in there and again, apply the spirit of understanding the context in which the data were generated, that applies, you know, that exists in a randomized clinical trial in a non-RCT data environment, you're really limited in how you can use that data. Has to be for a less rigorous purpose. I don't know if I answered that very clearly.
Thank you, Michelle. I think so. Sharon, one of the questions from our audience is asking about the year 2020. Has this created disruption in which direction with regards to some of these opportunities for using real-world data in our studies? Has it slowed down studies to the point that we're not able to do as much? Has it amplified the need for integrating real-world data into our studies? Do you have a barometer on the influence of 2020 on this use case, these use cases we're talking about?
Yeah, at least from my perspective, and again, it's with several hundred advocacy organizations and the work that they're doing with companies, it was hugely impactful. The beginning of the year, certainly after March, saw a real panic about lots and lots of trials grinding to halt, and the hope that they would resume in the summer or the fall. And now we know that that won't happen till, who knows, maybe mid next year or late next year. And quick scrambling on the part of various entities to make a difference. So a lot of us had for many years, and Craig, you've been right in this arena, wanted to have clinical trials done differently, and this catalyzed huge changes. They're necessary now, and there's more willingness to try some of the things that we've been actually setting up for years and ready to use. So that's a good part of the story. I think the other part is what to do about regulatory environments, about the way other organizations that we partner with have sort of stayed in their lane and hope that things would stay the same, which I do find in biomedical research very common, in the sense that it's hard. There's a lot of inertia. It's hard to get change to happen the way it should. But this was a real huge catalytic event this year that I think will cause real change. And there's a lot of people worried about, well, will we just go back to what was normal when it's over? And I don't think so. I think that there are some learnings that are being gathered, and even webinars such as this, where we're starting to put together some good and meaningful direction.
Thank you, Sharon. Sean, we're coming into the last few minutes. This time has just flown by. Sean, one question, just building on Sharon talking about 2020, Michelle brought up the COVID vaccines. Janssen, J&J may be one of the last COVID vaccines in the US to be able to use a traditional placebo model, just given the rate with which new vaccines will likely start to become more widely available. Do you see some of these data uses becoming important for future COVID-19 vaccine trials?
Well, I think for any clinical trial that aims to understand the experience of large populations of patients, tapping into real-world data sources, and leveraging technological innovations such as tokenization is going to be of critical importance. And I think any vaccine trial should incorporate these new novel technological solutions to, again, capture the longitudinal experience of patients. And in terms of things like prospective clinical trial tokenization, getting a longitudinal experience of patients who were enrolled in the study, or in the context of retrospective analyses, better understanding how certain susceptibilities and demographic features influence response to vaccines, and similar modalities of intervening in terms of trying to control public health emergencies and urgencies. So I think real-world data in the context of addressing global public health issues, including epidemics, and in fact, trying to reduce the risk of a future pandemic is going to be of critical importance, because addressing future pandemics is all about understanding what's happening in the real world, on the ground, locally, in local communities, and developing strategies to bring solutions to local environments before things go out of hand. And real world evidence is clearly one of the only means, among the I should say, among I would say the most important and practical ways of detecting future public health local outbreaks that before they get out of hand.
You, Sean. We are in our last moments here, and I'm just going to ask each of you in less than a minute, what is one action that our audience can take away and bring to life in 2021? Less than a minute each. Michelle, could you get us started?
I would love to. I'm actually going to pick off of the Q&A. There are so many questions about the suitability of data sources. Do you pick a messier one? Do you pick a narrow one? Do you pick EMR? Do you pick that? So for 2021, let's start thinking about the clinical question or the commercial question we're answering, the value proposition, and let's be wide-eyed and curious about the data sources and match the best data source to the question.
Beautiful. Sharon, an action, a takeaway for our audience for 21.
I think that if we decided that we're going to collaborate and learn from each other as quickly as possible, particularly around methods that aren't in the competitive space, that we would accelerate this process so that we are making a really meaningful difference in 2021.
Fabulous. And Sean, a takeaway for our audience, an action they can start to work against and move in this area for 21.
I think 2021 is going to be a pivotal moment in so many different ways, including in the world of real-world evidence and therapeutic development in general. And many of us are facing two decisions. Do we go back to doing things the old way, or do we continue on the path of innovation and thinking about new ways of optimizing clinical trials and biomedical research. And my, to the extent that it's worth, my advice would be, let's not go back to the old ways. We have a tremendous opportunity right now to continue on the path of innovation. And as I say, necessity is the mother of invention. And there are a lot of lessons learned in the past year that can be applied to 2021 to really carve a new path forward in how we think about therapeutic development and real-world evidence. And we have to really fight the urge to go back to the old ways, because there's some comfort in that. However, in the greater scheme of things, it's going to be fundamentally counterproductive. And we don't want to have another surprise on our hands in a couple of years.
There is no going back for sure. I would like to thank our hosts for bringing us together on this important topic, our friends at Datavant. I'd like to thank our panelists, Michelle, Sharon, Sean, and Chris in absentia. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for sharing this hour with us, and more importantly, for sharing your questions and thoughts along the way. Everybody stay safe, enjoy the coming holiday season, and hopefully we'll have more of these opportunities in the future. Bye now.